Hey everybody, Mr. Sioka here, and today we want to look at changes to equilibrium. So let's get started. In our last lesson, we took a look at what happens when market price is too high or market price is too low, and how ultimately shortages and surpluses occur in the marketplace. But we said, don't worry about it. In the end, something called the bidding mechanism will kick in. If the market price is too high and there's a surplus, the bidding mechanism will kick in to result in price getting bid down, and the market will find the equilibrium price and quantity that buyers and sellers can both agree on. If the market price is too low, there'll be a shortage, but don't worry, the bidding mechanism will kick in, and in very short order, market price will get bid upward, quantity demanded and quantity supplied will adjust, and the market ultimately will find the market price that equates quantity demanded and quantity supplied to each other. And in the end, this becomes the market equilibrium price, which we'll just refer to as P from now on, and the market equilibrium quantity that we'll refer to as Q from now on. And thus, once we have found the equilibrium, the market tends to stay there unless acted upon by an outside force. So what we want to look at this module is what happens when one of those outside forces happens, and what is it that they affect? Well, they're either going to affect the customer's willingness and ability to buy the product, or the producer's willingness and ability to sell the product. So let's take a look at an example. Imagine in our candy bar marketplace, something happened to suddenly make customers more willing and able to buy. And as a result, the demand curve shifted to the right. Demand curve shifted to the right. Well, notice, while the various quantities supplied will be the same, all of these quantities demanded would now be different. And we'd have a new higher quantities demanded at each and every price. Now, let's assume for sake of argument that price immediately doesn't change. Price was 60 cents, and it stays 60 cents. Well, this demand curve has gone away. It doesn't exist anymore. It's moved to this position. And let's see what happens when price stays at 60 cents, but we have a new demand curve. Well, a price of 60 cents intersects our supply curve at 200, right there. And a price of 60 cents intersects our new demand curve right there at a quantity of 400. So in the end, we would have what we call a shortage. Customers willing and able to buy 400, but a producer was only willing to produce 200 at that price. And we all know from last module what happens when there's a shortage. Price would start to rise. So price would rise, and when price rises, quantity supplied increases, quantity demand decreases, and in the end, we would find a new market equilibrium. The same is true in this example. We have our original supply and demand equilibrium at 60 cents and 200, 200, but something happens and the producer suddenly becomes more willing and able to produce. Why? I don't know, but let's just pretend it happened. So this supply curve suddenly ceases to exist, and we have a new supply curve further to the right. But if price doesn't change, we know what's going to happen. Quantity supplied is going to exceed quantity demanded, and we're going to have a surplus. But we know when surplus occurs, market price gets bid downward. So the price is going to start getting bid downward. Quantity demanded increases, so quantity demanded will start to increase, and quantity supplied would decrease, and quantity supplied would decrease. And the market would try to find a new equilibrium. Well, what we want to talk about in this process is or in this module, is how this process plays out. So I'm going to introduce you to Mr. Sioka's 6 steps on how to find a new market equilibrium. So let's get going. I want you to imagine we had a normal good. And that normal good is, I don't know, pencils. So we've got a product, pencils. And let's assume there's an increase in consumer income. And for purposes of this exercise, let's assume that pencils are a normal good. How would an increase in consumer income affect the equilibrium, price, and quantity of pencils? Well, this is a 6-step process. And I know some students can kind of guess ahead and go, I know where we're going with this. What I'm basically teaching you is how to graph using the 6 steps. So we are always going to use all 6 steps because the graphs ultimately get very, very complex in macroeconomics. So if we learn them properly from the beginning and we use them properly from the beginning, we'll build upon them and we'll have great graphs at the end too. So step 1 says, draw the market for pencils in equilibrium. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to draw my price axis. I'm going to draw my quantity axis. I'm going to draw my downward sloping demand curve. And I'm going to draw my upward sloping supply curve. And step 1's done. I've drawn the graph in equilibrium. Check. Step 2, we have to label the equilibrium price and quantity, and we're going to label them P1 for first price and Q1 for first quantity. But we have to find that equilibrium. Maybe initially the price started too high and it got bid downward, or maybe the price started too low and it got bid upward. But either way, ultimately, the market finds an equilibrium where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So I'm going to label that as Q1 and P1. Step 2, done. Okay, step 3. If what's happening, is it a demand issue or a supply issue? Now, this is where knowing the 2 lists of determinants is really mission critical. So, change in consumer income. Well, let me go through my supply list first. Is that a change in input price? No. Is that a change in the number of producers? No. Is that a technological innovation? No. Change in the price of an alternative good? No. Does it say anything about the product being taxed or subsidized? No and no. So it's not a shift in supply. So the next question is, let's go through demand. Change in the number of customers? No. Change in consumer tastes and preferences? No. Change in consumer income? Ding, 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 ding. Absolutely. That's what it is. So I know right off the bat that I'm dealing with a change in demand. It's a demand shift. Okay, step 3, done. Step 4, we have to shift the proper curve. So the question is, if you have an increase in income, and the good is normal, it says so right in the question, which way will demand shift? Well, we learned that demand increases. It shifts to the right if income rises and a good's normal. So I'm going to shift the demand curve to the right, and I'm going to label it D2. So I've shifted the proper curve. Step 4, done. Now I know if price doesn't go up, I'm going to end up with a shortage right there. But luckily, price can go up, and price rises to a new equilibrium. So let me get my red pen out again, and we see the new equilibrium where supply and demand meet right there. And as a result, we see that a higher equilibrium quantity is bought and sold, and these pencils are sold at a higher equilibrium price. Step 5, done. Step 6, interpret the cause and effect. The cause is always what happened to demand or supply. In this instance, it was an increase in demand. Consumer income is an increase in demand. And the effect of consumers suddenly becoming more willing and able to buy was that the price of the product went up and the quantity bought and sold in the marketplace also went up. So we have our 6-step process of understanding consumer and producer mindset. And we saw how when we undergo this 6-step process, we can see how changes in consumers' mindsets ultimately did impact the market price. So let's try another one. Using all 6 steps, graphically illustrate how an increase in jet fuel prices will affect the equilibrium price and quantity of airline transportation. What I'd like you to do is pause this video and try and graph the solution using all 6 steps. When you're done, hit play and we'll go over it together. Okay, let's go over it. Step 1, let's draw the graph for airline transportation in equilibrium. So I've got price and my price axis. I've got quantity axis, which I'll label Q. I've got the supply of airline transportation drawn as upward sloping. And I've got the demand for airline transportation, which I've drawn as downward sloping. Step 1, done. Step 2, label the equilibrium price and quantity. So there's where supply and demand meet. And I know quantity supplied and quantity demand will be equal at the equilibrium. I'll label it Q1, and that's the price that does that. Step 2, done. Okay, an increase in jet fuel prices. Well, what is jet fuel to providing airline transportation? It's an input. It's a natural resource used to provide the product. And if there's an increase in the price of a resource, that increases total cost of production. And anything that increases total cost of production causes a decrease in supply. So step 3, we know it's a supply shift. Okay, step 4, we know that when cost of production rises, supply shifts, and it shifts to the left. Higher costs of production make producers less willing and able to produce at each and every price. Supply curve shifts to the left. Step 4, done. Step 5, find new equilibrium. Well, I know with a decrease in supply, if price doesn't change, we're going to end up having a shortage right there. But luckily, price does change. And as a result of price changing, let's see what happens. And let's see, get my red pen, and we find the new equilibrium right there. Q2 and P2. Step 5, done. Step 6, cause and effect. Well, the cause was a decrease in supply. Producers became less willing and able to produce. And the effect of that, the effect of a producer becoming less willing and able to produce, was that the price of the product went up and less was bought and sold. Price went up, quantity went down. These 6 steps are mission critical items that will help us become expert economists, we hope. Okay, now at this point, you're kind of sitting there saying, Mr. Shioka, the reality is there's only 4 things that can happen, right? And that's true. we can have an increase in demand. That means customers become more willing and able to buy. And when the customer becomes more willing and able to buy, holding supply constant, this usually results in higher prices and more being bought and sold. Option 2, the buyer becomes less willing and able to buy. Holding supply constant, a buyer who becomes less willing and able to buy will result in typically lower prices and less being bought and sold in the marketplace. Or I can hold demand constant and increase supply. And when that happens, price typically falls and quantity typically rises. And of course, option 4, producers become less willing and able to sell. Holding demand constant, we see price goes up and quantity goes down. So these are what are called the 4 market forces: increases or decreases in demand, increases or decreases in supply. Now remember something, these changes in supply and demand are changes in buyers and sellers' mindsets. They're changes in their state of minds. But what we've learned from this model is changes in a buyer's mental state as to what they're willing and able to buy ultimately have real world implications on the prices of goods and services in the marketplace and the amount actually bought and or produced. I hope you found this helpful. There's an exercise following this video where I'm going to ask you to graph some supply and demand graphs and tell me what happens to the market price and how many are bought and sold in the marketplace. Thanks a lot. See you next video.